Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elaine O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm okay. I'm not great, but I'm okay.
You're okay?
Yeah. I've been craving pesto all day.
Oh, I can see the problem.
Yes. But what's funny is that we're having a cocktail into which you placed basil. And so I'm not great, but I'm on the mend.
Oh, good.
Because there's basil. And there's you, and there's conversation, and there's our friends.
Yay.
So it's all good.
All good things. Yeah, so we are having a cocktail from our Cocktail Theology cocktail book, which if you are a donor and have been a donor, you probably have. If you would like to get a copy and donate to our ministry here, School for Seekers, we would be most happy to send you a digital copy. We do hope to have a physical copy available on Amazon before the end of the year of our Cocktail Theology cocktail book. But the one that we're drinking today is called By Any Other Name. And
you can tell this is one of my names, can't you?
It is a rose cocktail. It uses Kettle One's grapefruit and rose botanical vodka. It uses a rose simple syrup. It also features basil. And today we also topped it with a splash of Prosecco, just to give it a little bit of light fizz. It's very sweet and fruity, but also has that clean herbal scent of basil, which is so nice. And it makes for a really nice drink in our coupe glass.
Absolutely. So besides roses and basil and such, what are we talking about today?
Well, today I thought it might be fun.
You have a weird idea of fun, my friend.
I know. To talk about cults. What is a cult? I remember, like, when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, cults would show up in the news from time to time. It seemed like it was a period of time where cults were happening, and it was dramatic. There were sometimes there were aliens, sometimes there were
the cult, or as the object of
as
cults,
the object of the cult. There were, they happened, in the desert, and they happened in the mountains, and they were just like popping up everywhere, and they were always dramatic. When, the police would have to show up and drag people out and stuff like that. Cults are something that I've been fascinated with. And I thought it might be interesting to our listeners to talk about what is a cult, what makes a cult, and how are cults still very much present in our society today.
Yes.
Because I do believe they are.
Oh, they are. And even if you don't want to call something a cult, cultish behavior and engaging people in a cultic way in that sense is absolutely what's going on in many places.
For sure.
In religion and outside of religion.
Yes.
So
as we were discussing earlier, the markers of what a cult is, one of the main markers of a cult is that there is a central living or recently living figure who is charismatic, who is viewed by cult members as pretty darn infallible. Their views are not to be questioned, and there is a veneration or a reverence for this person. That's definitely one of the markers that we see of cults.
Yes.
And using that definition, I believe there are probably church congregations that I have known that sort of fall into that category.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the unquestioning loyalty is a really important piece, and it also reflects the other thing that we were talking about earlier, which is the us versus them mentality.
Yes.
Right? So inside a cult is the only safe place to be. It's the only righteous place to be. And of course you don't question it because you're in the right. And it really doesn't matter what the cult leader says. You're in the right as long as you don't question. Now, as soon as you question, that becomes a problem. But the goal often, in someone who is either intentionally or unintentionally setting himself or herself, although it's usually a him, up as that kind of figure, that sense of us and them is absolutely critical. So in religious cults particularly, you'll see the cult leader create a space, usually a commune type location, for people to come and be that separates them from others. And because cults often work on the basis of you are welcome here, you're part of us, and appeal to people who have felt hurt or unwelcome or in a big way misunderstood, there's that sense of you are being welcomed in. And then the cult often either makes you feel afraid to leave, both because you will never be able to come back or because the outside world will destroy you, or it makes you not want to leave because there's this extreme danger outside.
Yes.
Right? So there's that. The other piece that you mentioned earlier was that cults are really focused on bringing people in and bringing them in kind of a deep way so that they give everything to the cult. Loyalty can be the kind of the least of it, but often it's money, often it's stuff, often, those kinds of things.
Right. And yielding like your own personal right to make choices.
Yes.
Because you basically give authority of your life over to this cult or over to this cult leader.
Right.
So it is a mind-numbing, brainwashing sort of situation where you sort of lose touch with who you are, your own humanity, maybe in the context of this cult.
Right.
You mentioned us versus them. The evil and the awfulness of the them just gets amplified times a billion, so that somebody doesn't just have a different opinion.
Correct.
They're the devil themselves.
Correct.
So it's like it is only our way. If anybody tells you different,
that's right.
They are evil and horrible and
that's
wrong.
Right. Well, they're raping babies in the basement. I mean, it's that kind of us and them thing.
Right.
Even if it's a cult that speaks in language of love, that sense that you will only be truly loved if you are in the cult, it has the same effect.
It does.
Right.
Some examples of cultic behavior that we see around us. As I mentioned, I believe there are some churches that function that way. I'm thinking of one church in particular in my hometown, back in Tennessee, where the pastor has completely gone off the rails. He's been in the national media a few times regarding COVID. He has told his members they aren't welcome there if they wear a mask. He has since then demonized books, and they had a big bonfire burning Harry Potter books. He has put himself in a position of authority over this congregation where he expects a certain behavior from them. And if anything that you say or do, either inside or outside of the church, contradicts that, then you're no longer welcome.
Exactly. Yeah, you've got to be in line.
Yeah, you have to fall in line.
Yeah.
And I unfortunately, I know that's not the only church like that, and he's not the only pastor like that.
Right. I want to lift up that as we're thinking about this, cultic, in this kind of sense, behavior is not always as obvious as that, right? That's obvious.
That's a really obvious example, yeah.
One of the examples that I've seen of behavior of this type, though I would not call the overall effect a cult, is there's a very famous pastor, well-known televangelist and other kind of evangelist, prosperity person, who at one point in all of the swag that they sold had a little Jesus symbol with his own initials in the middle of it. And that kind of re-centralizing oneself as the savior is cultish.
I also wonder too, there's a show, I'm not endorsing that our listeners watch this show, but there's a show called The Righteous Gemstones that's on HBO right now. It follows this family of evangelists, and they've created their empire. There's a church, there's a TV network. It's loosely based on actual people that we've known, kind of an amalgam of personalities that we've known in religious entertainment or whatever you want to call that. And they're sort of portrayed, not so much the patriarch, but the kids are kind of portrayed as buffoons. They're money hungry, and they're all these things. But at the top, the main pastor is played by John Goodman. And while
I love John Goodman so much.
He's so brilliant.
All right,
and,
go
and
ahead.
he's good in the role. Again,
Yeah.
The show has a lot of problems, so I'm not necessarily endorsing the show. But I think that sometimes what happens, it's not a cult necessarily, but I think that the charisma of a personality can draw people in, and they give money in ways that they wouldn't ordinarily, or they commit to things within that organization that they wouldn't ordinarily. So it's its own kind of brainwashing.
Yeah, it becomes a replacement way of thinking, I think is a good way to think about it. So it isn't that one takes in some of it, rejects some of it, or even is enamored of it. Mm-hmm. It's as though the thoughts you had before either don't make sense anymore or must be replaced, right? I admit that I have a tiny bit of admiration for people who can do this. Tiny, minuscule, because it is such a perfect, now you are part of us, you're so welcome, you're safe. I mean, even if it's abusive, there's this sense of connection. And, again, this is one of the reasons it can appeal so much to people who felt disconnected or harmed, right? So that's a big piece of it as well. That seeding of your own way of thinking, doing things that you would have considered grossly immoral in the past, and that requirement, either internal or external, that you give whatever is asked by the cult leader or by the cult leaders.
Yeah, without question.
Okay, so Christianity has been accused, as a whole, has been accused of being a cult. Why is that not true? It isn't true.
Well, I think, first of all, Jesus doesn't fit some of the criteria of being a cult leader.
Okay.
Jesus never asked his followers to not think for themselves. Jesus would never have been offended if someone had asked him. I mean, Thomas asked him,
right,
show me your hands. He wasn't offended by the question or by the request. So I think Jesus never put himself in a position of power over people. Jesus lived among the people. When he was exalted, it was because the people exalted him, and then the same people that exalted him tore him down. So the power that Jesus possessed wasn't demanded. It wasn't put in front of people to say, you will not question this. I think Jesus would be appalled by the way that cult leaders and pastors who put themselves in that kind of authority over groups of people behave.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And in my experience, any system of thinking that includes something that is non-tangible, I'm hesitating to use religion because that has its own weirdness to it, can be used as a mechanism for cultishness.
Sure, yeah.
So the Second Amendment can be used as a mechanism for cults, right? The idea that some other group of people are, raping babies in the basement can be used as the basis for a cult, right?
Yes.
It isn't exactly about the personality of the person, but it is highly engendered by particular personalities. Authoritarian, whether they demand love or they demand anger against others, it's still authoritarian. It's that kind of thing, yeah. And Jesus was anything but authoritarian.
Right. In fact, many would say Jesus was kind of a communist.
Yeah. Or a wuss.
Or a wuss.
Like one of the things that always strikes me as remarkable is when I look for images of Jesus on Google, and he's got a machine gun, or he's got, right, you know what,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
And we do that because that sense that Jesus is too effeminate, Jesus is too weak, is offensive to people,
It is.
right? So we're going to throw him into Rambo clothes and get him out there and show just how strong and pro-America he is. And it's like, oh my goodness.
Right.
Yeah, which is cultish behavior.
It is cultish behavior. I completely agree. And I think a lot of the us versus them mentality, it veers into that cultish mindset. There's a personality or an ideology that people are drawn to, and the more drawn into it they become, the more the villains become everybody else.
Yes.
So
yes.
The real issue for many of us as Jesus followers today has to do with recognizing the will and dignity of each other.
Yes.
I think so much of it comes down to recognizing that we can disagree, but that doesn't make you less human. It doesn't make you less of a person.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of what's happening right now, what we see is we have dithered down a person's personhood to this set of, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about this? What do you believe about this? Well, then you belong to this, and this is bad. Or you belong to this, and that means you're one of us. We have lost respecting each other's humanity and treating each other with dignity when we put ourselves in these us versus them kind of categories.
In the extreme.
Yeah.
And let's be really, really clear. Any political point of view can do this. Any religious point of view can do this. It doesn't have to be either politics or religion, but those are such big categories that it's easy to use them. So I got accused of being a cult leader once.
Really? How did that go?
Well, I laughed. I found it really puzzling and amusing, but the person who did it was speaking on behalf of someone else who felt threatened by me. So I lift that up as a challenge to all of us to not be too hasty to throw words like this at others. Not because we are wrong, but because we should pay attention. Words matter.
Yes.
And to say someone is a cult leader without having the evidence around it is damaging, potentially.
It's damaging to the person, and it's also damaging to those who are paying attention to what the person said.
Exactly. So, for example, imagine I'm a cult leader for a moment, and that's going to get quoted somewhere, and somewhere someone will say, she said she admitted to being a cult leader. But imagine that I'm a cult leader for a moment, and I say something like, try this practice on. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, fine. Come back next week. Right? So, first of all, that tweak, that alone shows it's not cultic.
It's not cultic,
right?
No.
But here's the thing, is if somebody is told that I'm a cult leader, and then people don't try on a practice that might be useful to them, like gratitude, because, oh my gosh, that's part of a cult, right? Dallas Willard, the Christian philosopher who was not a cult leader, said something brilliant, many brilliant things, but this one really I love. He said, just because Hindus eat breakfast doesn't mean breakfast is bad.
That's good, yeah.
Right? And of course he didn't think Hindus were bad, but that notion that just because somebody else that you don't necessarily think is right does something doesn't make that thing wrong necessarily.
Right.
Or just because someone you think is perfect does something doesn't make it right.
Yes. Exactly.
And that's the cult problem.
What do you guys think about cults? Have you ever been around one?
Or
Have
part
you
of
ever
one?
been part of one? Do you see examples of culty behavior among people you care about, or even in your own church? We would love to hear about that. You can always email us, Elaine, E-L-A-N-E, or Benton, B-E-N-T-O-N, at schoolforseekers.com. Email us your thoughts on cults and anything else that you feel like talking with us about. We love asking for topics, and so if you have an idea for something you'd like to hear us talk about, please send it along. Also, cocktail recipes. We're always excited about trying new cocktails.
Please.
So please do that.
Or if you have a name for a cocktail and we need to design a cocktail to go with the name, that would be fun too.
Oh, that would be fun. That's a fun challenge. I like that. Okay. Yeah, send us names for cocktails, and then we have to come up with a drink. That sounds great.
The Benton.
Ooh. Who knows what that would be. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Please share us with friends, because that's how we grow this audience. So if you appreciate what we do, please share it with other people.
But stay friends with them if they don't like us. Okay?
It's true. We're not a cult. We're not.
Please.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.